Currently, Earth. The 15th of June in 1215 is when King John put his seal on the Magna Carta. This document essentially was a peace treaty between John and his barons. It guaranteed that the king would respect feudal rights and privileges, uphold the freedom of the church, and maintain the nation's laws. The preceding ruler of England was Richard the Lion-Hearted, John's brother, and the rightful heir to the throne by law of primogeniture was actually Richard's nephew, Arthur, Duke of Brittany, the 13-year-old son of Henry II's third son, Geoffrey. It wasn't until a Friday on the 19th of June, 1215 AD, that King John fixed his seal to the Magna Carta, or Greater Charter. This document, issued at Runnymede in 1215 AD, is revered today as the foundation of some of our modern freedoms. On June 15, 1776, the Assembly of the Lower Counties of Pennsylvania declares itself independent of British and Pennsylvanian authority, thereby creating the state of Delaware. Before Delaware was settled by Eastern Hemisphere settlers, the area was home to the Eastern Algonquian tribes known as the Unami and Lenape, or Delaware, who lived mostly along the coast, and the Nanticoke, who occupied much of the southern Delmarva Peninsula. Most of the free African-American families in Delaware before the Revolution had migrated from Maryland to find more affordable land. They were descendants chiefly of relationships or marriages between white servant women and enslaved servant or free African or African-American men. Under slavery law, children took the social status of their mothers, so children born to white women were free, regardless of their paternity, just as children born to enslaved women were born into slavery. As the flow of indentured laborers to the colony decreased with improving economic conditions in England, more slaves were imported for labor, and the caste lines hardened. The only major battle of the Revolution that took place in Delaware was the Battle of Couch's Bridge, which began on August 30th, 1777. The British occupied Wilmington after the Battle of Brandywine and took control of the Delaware River until the end of the war. In 1783, the American Revolution effectively came to an end and Delaware was confirmed in the Treaty of Paris. Delaware was the first colony to ratify our Constitution and officially became a state on December 7, 1787. On June 15th, in 1846, the U.S.-Canadian border was established. Representatives from Great Britain and the United States met together to sign the Oregon Treaty, which settled a long-standing dispute with Great Britain over who controlled the Oregon Territory. The treaty established the 49th parallel from the Rocky Mountains to the Strait of Georgia as a boundary between the United States and British Canada. We gained formal control over the future states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And the British retained Vancouver Island and navigation rights to part of the Columbia River. Back in 1818, a U.S.-British agreement established the 49th parallel. The two nations also agreed to a joint occupation of Oregon Territory for 10 years, an arrangement that was extended for an additional 10 years in 1827. After 1838, The issue of who possessed Oregon became increasingly controversial, especially when mass American migration along the Oregon Trail began in the early 1840s. The old established border of Lake of Woods in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west were no longer agreeable terms without Oregon. American expansionists urged the seizure of Oregon, and in 1844, Democrat James K. Polk successfully ran for president under the platform 54, 40, or fight, which referred to his hope of bringing a sizable portion of present-day Vancouver and Alberta into the United States. James Knox Polk, our 11th president, nor the British government wanted a third Anglo-American war, and on June 15, 1846, the Oregon Treaty, a compromise, was signed. By the terms of the agreement, the U.S. and Canadian border was extended west along the 49th parallel to the Strait of Georgia, just short of the Pacific Ocean. On June 15th in 1877, Henry Ossian Flipper becomes the first African American to graduate from West Point. Henry Ossian Flipper was an American soldier, engineer, former slave, and in 1877 the first African American to graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point, earning a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He was also an author who wrote about scientific topics and his life experiences. After his commissioning, he was assigned to one of the all-black regiments of the United States Army, which were historically led by white officers. Assigned to A Troop under the command of Captain Nicholas M. Nolan, he became the first non-white officer to lead Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry. Flipper served with competence and distinction during the Apache Wars and the Victoria Campaign, but was haunted by rumors alleging improprieties. Eventually, he was court-martialed and dismissed from the U.S. Army. After losing his commission in the Army, Flipper worked throughout Mexico and Latin America as an assistant to the Secretary of the Interior. He retired to Atlanta in 1931 and continued his eternity in 1940. In 1994, his descendants applied to the U.S. military for a review of Flipper's court-martial and dismissal. A review found the conviction and punishment were unduly harsh and unjust, and recommended Flipper's dismissal be changed to a good conduct discharge. Shortly afterwards, an application for pardon was filed with the Secretary of the Army, which was forwarded to the Department of Justice. Our 42nd President, Bill Clinton, posthumously pardoned Lieutenant Henry O. Flipper on February 19, 1999, 118 years after his conviction. On June 15th in 1917, the United States Congress passed the Espionage Act. Now, this was 2 months after our country had formally entered World War I. This was enforced largely by A. Mitchell Palmer, the United States Attorney General under President Woodrow Wilson. The Espionage Act essentially made it a crime for any person to convey information intended to interfere with U.S. armed forces, prosecution of war effort, or to promote the success of the country's enemies. Anyone found guilty of such acts would be subject to a fine of $10,000 and a prison sentence of 20 years. The Espionage Act was reinforced by the Sedition Act of the following year, which imposed similarly harsh penalties on anyone found guilty of making false statements that interfered with the prosecution of war, insulting or abusing the U.S. government, the flag, the Constitution, or the military, agitating against the production of necessary war materials, or advocating, teaching, or defending any of these acts. Both pieces of legislation were aimed at socialists, pacifists, and other anti-war activists during World War I and were used to punishing effect in the years immediately following the war, during a period characterized by the fear of communist influence and communist infiltration into American society that became known as the First Red Scare. Palmer, a former pacifist whose views on civil rights radically changed once he assumed the Attorney General's office during the Red Scare, and his right-hand man, J. Edgar Hoover, liberally employed the Espionage and Sedition Acts to persecute left-wing political figures. One of the most famous activists arrested during this period, labor leader Eugene V. Debs, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech he made in 1918 in Canton, Ohio, criticizing the Espionage Act. Debs appealed the decision, and the case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where the court upheld his conviction. Though Debs' sentence was commuted in 1921 when the Sedition Act was repealed by Congress, major portions of the Espionage Act remain part of the United States law to the present day. On June 15th, in 1946, our country presents the Baruch Plan for the international control of atomic weapons to the United Nations. The failure of the plan to gain acceptance resulted in a dangerous nuclear arms race between us and the Soviet Union, also known as the Cold War. Our country is the only nation to use atomic bombs during wartime. After World War II, our nation did have a monopoly of the most destructive weapons known to humankind. There were certain people in our government who felt that we should share our atomic secrets with the Soviets. One of the fears was that a continuing U.S. monopoly on atomic weapons would only result in growing Russian suspicions and an eventual arms race. Others, such as State Department officials, strenuously argued against this position. The Soviets, these people declared, could not be trusted, and the United States would be foolish to relinquish its atomic ace in the hole. The United Nations Atomic Energy Commission was established to maintain international control over the spread and development of nuclear weapons and technology. Bernard Baruch, a trusted advisor to U.S. presidents since the early 20th century, was tapped to formulate the American proposal and present it to the United Nations. Baruch did not trust the Soviets, and the proposal he devised reflected this. Baruch's proposal did provide for international control and inspection of nuclear production facilities, but clearly announced that the United States would maintain its nuclear weapons monopoly until after every aspect of the proposal was in effect and working. The Soviets, of course, rejected the Baruch Plan. So we rejected a Soviet counterproposal for a ban on all nuclear weapons, of course. By 1949, any discussion of international control of nuclear weapons was a very moot point. In September of that year, the Soviets successfully tested a nuclear device. During the next few years, the United States and Soviet Union raced to develop an ever more frightening arsenal of nuclear weapons, including the hydrogen bomb, MIRV missiles with multiple nuclear warheads, and the neutron bomb, designed to kill people but leave structures standing. Human creation and technological advancement is purely awesome. We have progress to incessantly make in this eternal realm. It's our motives and how we use the unlimited creations that will materialize from our complex minds. Let us use our power to always better existence for all who participate with us and our relative family who will come after us. Historic information on this audio file can be verified on history.com, worldatlas.com, wikipedia.com, and The History of England by Jasper Godwin Ridley.